Welcome back to my channel. I'm continuing my series of videos on bereavement apparitions and Dale Allison's book from 2021 on the resurrection and supposed parallels between bereavement apparitions and what we find in the Gospels. I had intended to break up some of the material in today's video into multiple videos, but I found that it really flowed together and that there was no way of doing that would not be artificial. So today I'm going to be talking about touch and polymodality, probabilities, and also mentioning eating and drinking and putting those together. Allison has a very long footnote with bits from modern apparition literature regarding touch, and some of them just say seeming solid, but several of them actually do claim definite touch. They say things like, I felt him touch my shoulder. He hugged me. His body was warm. He looked and felt just like he was living. And he has a few quotes like this also in the main text on page 228 to 229. And then he has this comment: testimony such as this adds real ambiguity to the stories of people touching the risen Jesus and seeing him eat and drink, even were one to take those stories to enshrine video-like history. That's page 229. Now, he also says that he doesn't, in fact, take it that way. But he's saying that even if you take it that this is what they really experienced, there's real ambiguity. And I'm going to be arguing today that evidentially speaking, there is not real ambiguity. I'll get to eating and drinking in a moment, and I'll also talk about group experiences. But I'm going to start by talking about probabilities and even individual experience, which is where Allison's point might seem the strongest, because these attestations of seeming tangibility seem to occur, as far as I've been able to tell by reading Allison himself, even in the literature he cites, only in individual cases. Okay, so he has a section also on several experiences that he and his family had of a person who had died. One set concerns a close friend of the family, and one concerns Dr. Allison's father. Concerning the friend, Allison says that she did not appear transparent, but that she didn't say anything, that she appeared only, this was his own experience, very briefly, she appeared to be triumphant, and the experience conveyed comfort. Now this takes us back to what we talked about in a previous video, that Jesus was not a defeated victim of death, but also Allison's admission that we mentioned there, that often in apparition experiences, the person just appears briefly, doesn't say or do anything else, and then disappears. Okay, on another occasion he says he had a strong sense of presence that appeared to be located behind him on his left, and it seemed to him that this was his dead friend. So that's just a sense as if someone's behind you. That's not polymodal experience. Concerning his father, he says two of his children separately told him that they had individually seen their grandfather, and one of the children said that the grandfather had told him a secret which he couldn't tell. He couldn't pass on because it was a secret. He mentions that his wife said that shortly after his father passed away, she felt that his spirit somehow hovered near the ceiling. All right, that his spirit was hovering near the ceiling. So that's not sensory. It's kind of a notion like, something's up there. Or if it is sensory, it's not, this kind of polymodal interaction. One of his brothers told him that he heard their father's voice in his mind, in his head, advising him about financial matters, and on another occasion telling him to call a friend and wish her a happy birthday. And then others had a sense of presence experience, or claimed that they just saw the father at the time of his interment. Now, all of this is somewhat interesting if one is interested primarily in the paranormal and in whether there are veridical cases where the dead somehow appear to the living. But none of it sounds like someone who is bodily resurrected from the dead. And this, of course, relates to a point that I believe N.T. Wright has made, which is that when people have these experiences, they don't convince them that the person is alive. They are seen as a communication from a dead person. And I think a reason for that is that they aren't like the gospel experiences in the sense that the person doesn't seem to be trying to convey that he's alive, even if these are all truthful accounts, and even if they were in some sense veridical rather than being subjective. What all of this emphasizes, even if we take all these experiences at face value, is that there's a lot more variation in apparition experiences among possible experience types, and that in this sense they differ quite radically from what is expected if a person is really present bodily. I'll come back to that in a moment. Some of these stories could be dreams, presumably not all, but the children, there's one child experience that he narrates that was not one of his children, and it wasn't someone known to him. It's a different child. She was actually lying in bed. Okay, so, and then she said that her grandfather was there with her and she could touch his beard and so forth. Well, I think most of us have experienced cases where we've been dreaming and we sort of slip seamlessly from being in our room or being in a place to dreaming that we're in that same place, and then that something happens and we don't note the transition to falling asleep. And so anytime you have a person who's actually sitting down or lying down, they're alone, presumably they're tired, especially if they're in the place where they usually do sleep, and then they say, it seemed to me that this dead person came in the door or whatever, talked to me and touched me and so forth. It just could be a dream. Now, by sheer coincidence, I was watching a video last night. It's a relatively new video called Songs of an American Dreamer by Jimmy Fortune. If you've followed all my stuff, I'm a little bit of a Jimmy Fortune fan. This is a really classy video. The music, especially the instrumentals, are just so nicely done. That's a digression. Anyway, it intersperses the songs with stories because Fortune likes to tell stories. He's a bit of a raconteur, and he tells a couple of stories about dreams. He calls them dreams. One of his deceased father and one of his deceased mother. And he's very definite. Like, he knew, he knows that he fell asleep. He even says about what time it was, that it was early in the morning when you fall into that kind of really deep sleep. When it's really late or early, depending on your perspective. And he's very explicit that he could feel the sense of touch. Like that when he hugged his father, he could feel his father's hand on his back. It really reminded me of some of these examples in Allison's stories. I could feel him. I felt him touch my shoulder. He was warm, etc. And in the case of his mother, she whispers something in his ear, and he says, and I could feel her breath whispering in my ear. Very vivid. But he's quite definite that it was a dream. And so I think some of these could be accounted that way. More importantly, the probabilities are far different of polymodality. Based on Allison's own account, the different sensory modalities like sight, hearing, and touch can come together or can come apart. Okay, even based on his anecdotes within his own life and then his listing of other stories within the modern apparition literature. None of the stories from Allison and his family bear a resemblance to what is recounted in the Gospels. So remember, I started by reading this adds real ambiguity to the stories. Well, you're giving stories of your own that aren't like that at all. And the same is true elsewhere, that tangible apparitions are only one type. And he's admitted that often the apparition says nothing, it just appears briefly and then is gone, and none of the gospel accounts are like that. You have sense of presence alone with no sensory modalities. You have auditory without visual, visual without auditory, visual and auditory without touch, okay? So you see what I'm getting at. So to understand how this affects the probabilities, I'm just going to give you a thought experiment. Suppose that you were told at 8 o'clock tonight, be in this room here by yourself, you are going to have an apparition type experience of so-and-so, and so-and-so, let's say, is someone who's dead. But you're going to have an apparition experience, and you're not told anything more, and you have read these pages of Allison and the footnotes where he lists those things and so forth, and these various accounts, and you've noticed these things, sense of presence sometimes alone, briefly appears often and then disappears, etc. And you know that sometimes the person feels like he's able to touch the person, assuming again that all of these are truthful accounts. And without any context of persecution, I just want to say right now that I don't automatically assume that they're truthful. But even taking that, taking them to be truthful, what probability would you put on being able to see, hear, touch, hand things to the person if all you were told is that 8 o'clock tonight you're going to have an apparition experience? Okay, think of that. Now contrast that. Suppose that you were told this person is going to be literally, physically present, bodily present in the room. And you believed it, You were told the person had been bodily resurrected, or God made an exception and let the person temporarily come back in his body. I don't know what metaphysics of this you'd be given, but you're definitely being told the person is going to be present in a body that is perceptible to normal senses. Okay, going to be present in a body, a real body, as you conceive of a body. Okay. Now, what probability would you have then that he'll be accessible simultaneously, that these different modalities will reinforce one another, right? Like you'll be, if it looks like the person has an apple in his hand, you're going to be able to grab the apple, or if you try to hand him an apple, he's going to be able to take the apple, or whatever. You see what I'm getting at, that you're going to be able to walk around him and see him 3D, that you're going to be able to hug him, feel his touch. Obviously, if the person is bodily present, that's all nearly guaranteed. Okay, that all of this, that's kind of what we mean by bodily presence. Literal bodily presence is that you're going to be able to access the person with multiple senses, and that they will mutually reinforce each other. So from an evidential point of view, there is really no comparison. You'd really be up in the air. After all, one of these experiences was feeling that the person's soul was up at the corner of the room. If the person is bodily present with you in a real body, you don't expect to just sort of sense that his soul is up in a corner of the room. I'm not trying to make fun of those experiences. What I'm pointing out, though, is that they're nothing like what we would expect if the person were literally physically present. And it's only a subset of them, even for a person who's alone, and that's important, but even for a person who's alone, the probability is much lower that he's going to have a non-dreaming, awake, apparitional experience where he's going to be able to interact in all of these sensory ways at once, even if we take that apparition literature at face value. So that's why it doesn't create real ambiguity. We have to think about probabilities here. All right, now that's just individual experiences. Now, I wanted to back up briefly to eating and drinking. You'll notice that in the quote I read, he says it creates real ambiguity to the stories of people touching the risen Jesus and seeing him eat and drink, even were one to take those stories to enshrine video-like history. Now, he just sort of slips that in there, but on page 221, he says explicitly that in the modern apparition literature, apparitions rarely eat or drink. It's like explicit. So he admits a disanalogy there, and then he just kind of slips it in there later, even if they were to enshrine video-like accuracy. Well, no, I mean, obviously you admitted that the probability would be much lower. Now, he continues concerning these stories in the Gospels. All right, this is on page 229, I believe. Now, I personally remain hesitant to find history in the demonstrations of Luke 24 and John 20-21. So this is after he said, even if they enshrine video-like accuracy. I rather detect Christian apologetics here and answer to the criticism that Jesus was merely a specter or hallucination. At the same time, and even though there was quite likely a tendency over the decades to make the appearances more solid, the comparative study of apparitions might be taken to reinforce the possibility that Luke 24 and John 20-21 preserve the primitive conviction that the risen Jesus seemed to some of those who encountered him to be not ethereal but utterly real, even solid. So this is this sort of back and forth. I don't think it's real. I don't think this is what they experienced, but maybe to some of them he seemed real and solid, which could presumably refer to individual experiences, right, in his mind, not to group experiences. So he doesn't say in so many words as he does elsewhere that the polymodality and sense of touch fits with the gospel accounts. We've seen him say things like that about other things, like speaking only briefly or not approaching, where he's like, wow, that's like what we find in the gospels, and it's a misrepresentation. There are counterexamples in the gospels. But he seems to want to get some cachet out of it. Like, well, even if they represent video-like accuracy, which I don't think, there's this ambiguity. Well, no, it doesn't make the evidential situation ambiguous. Strikingly, several of the places where Jesus is said to be tangible and where he interacts in tangible ways occur with two or more persons present. Okay, so even with regard to the individual cases, the probabilities would be very different. Even if we take his apparition literature at face value, it would be much less probable. But once you start adding in polymodal accounts and taking them with video-like accuracy to be at least what was experienced, they are in groups. So you want to talk about video-like accuracy, you're going to pan the video and you're going to see that there are all these people present and they're interacting with him. Now, I want to just point something out real quickly. When I do a maximal data argument for Jesus' resurrection, I actually back off one step and I say, this is what is claimed. Okay? I understand there's some concern sometimes, oh, you're misrepresenting Dale Allison because you're saying he doesn't believe in the bodily resurrection. Well, I'll stand by that one. He scoffs at the idea that Jesus had internal organs and so forth. But in his book, as I believe David Paulman recently pointed out, and as I've pointed out, he outright misrepresents Tim and me by saying that we take the gospel accounts, including Doubting Thomas, to be factual. Well, and then of course that looks completely circular. Not only do we not take them to be factual in that kind of circular way, we don't even take as a premise that that is definitely what they experienced. We take as a premise that that's what they claimed. Okay, that so that if you talked to them, Doubting Thomas would have been like, yeah, I denied it, but then I was there a week later and this is what happened, and so forth, so that these claims come from the original alleged witnesses. But Allison's talking about if you took it that this is what they experienced, and that if you took that to be, like as if you could see a video of what they experienced, and that would include a group. All right. Now, he dismisses this in his usual circular way. In Matthew 28:9, the women, plural, are able to grasp Jesus' feet. Now, as far as I know, I haven't found in Allison's book any place where it claims that multiple people were able to touch someone at the same time. Since that's a big difference. So here we go with our typical dismissal. Page 152. The other Gospels, in their narratives about the tomb, contain revisions and additions that reflect apologetical concerns. And then when he gets to Matthew 28:9, the women at the tomb are able to touch Jesus, so he is not a ghost. Ya think? Okay. No other reason is given for treating this as an invention for apologetic reasons. Apparently he considers it self-evident that if something would disconfirm they're seeing an apparition, it's probably made up. Give that some thought. The fact that multiple women are able to touch Jesus at once is a difference from the apparition literature. All right, even given his own summaries. All right. Similarly, in Luke 24, where Jesus asks for food, food is handed to him. Again, if this were a real experience, not only would the food not, it would just fall on the floor. If he was only there in a vision, if he wasn't physically present, you wouldn't expect him to be able to take the food and eat it and swallow it. Food disappears. But the handing experience would be a tangible experience. And because you can feel when something's taken from you out of your hand, right? So there's a polymodal aspect to it, which occurs in a group setting. The Doubting Thomas episode occurs in a group setting. Jesus invites multiple people. He issues a sort of general invitation in Luke 24 to touch him and see that he's not a ghost. Now, I want to give a little short digression here. This isn't about Allison, because I don't think he says this. At least I haven't been able to find him saying this, but you will occasionally hear this from skeptics or critical scholars, even if they're not considered skeptics. You'll sometimes hear as if it's this big significant thing. Well, you noticed it doesn't say that Thomas actually took Jesus up on his offer, that he actually did touch it. It doesn't say that the other disciples actually touched Jesus. If you find Allison saying this, let me know. But I had a vague memory that I'd seen him saying it, but I wasn't able to find it before doing this video. So maybe he doesn't, but it is something you'll hear, like it's this big deal. It's a very strange objection. And it's hard to know what the argument is supposed to be. So are we supposed to think that the authors or the members of the telephone game that preceded the writing of the Gospels or whoever were fine with just inventing these scenes, but they sort of stopped short and couldn't bring themselves to narrate that Thomas or the other disciples, the male disciples, actually did touch Jesus? Like, they're like, well, I'm making this up, but I got a conscience about saying that they took him up on the offer. Making up the offer, but won't go so far as to make up they're actually doing it. So that somehow the absence of a narrative of they're actually touching him at that point reflects some sort of dim recollection that the whole thing is made up, and that just doesn't make any sense. Or are we supposed to think, if you're an objective vision theorist, that Jesus really did appear in visionary form, and he really made the offer? Maybe he really made the offer, but it was a bluff. And if they actually tried to touch him, their hand would have gone through. And so it's like, woo, significant that he, offered, but we don't see them actually doing it. Maybe it wouldn't have worked if they'd really done it. I mean, that's just really poor. this is a kind of place that I really dislike, where you'll see an objector saying something like, well, like another one is, do you notice that there are no parables in John's gospel? Yeah, I noticed. And so what? Come on, what's your argument? So similarly here, if you hear someone saying that, and I'm not saying Allison says that, but if you hear someone saying that, notice they're not actually constructing any kind of argument or theory. It's just an insinuation that this is a problem for the bodily resurrection view, and it doesn't lead to anything. All right, back to Allison. With the group appearances especially, we can see that there are these disanalogies, even to what he claims about the modern apparition literature, but Allison doesn't allow the evidence to speak for itself, because whenever it's quite clear that it's disanalogous to apparition, he just contents himself with real ambiguity or whatever phrase, and then dismisses the evidence precisely because it is bodily and therefore would fulfill an apologetical purpose. And there's some really striking quotes in this respect. Page 64, converting a doubter in a story is a way to address doubt in one's audience, and put your finger here and see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side, sounds defensive, says Allison. And then this one's quite something on page 217. Indeed, the canonical Gospels themselves know the analogy just indicated. That's to an apparition. For they seek to refute it. According to Luke 24:39-43, Jesus cannot be merely a spirit or ghost because he can eat and be handled. John 20:24-29 is similar. Jesus says to doubting Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side, do not doubt but believe. To protest the parallel is to acknowledge it, says Allison. I'm going to read that again. To protest the parallel is to acknowledge it. What? I mean, this is exactly similar to a Freudian psychiatrist who gets you on the couch and says, if you're a man, so do you hate your father and want to kill him so you can marry your mother? And you say, no, I've never been conscious of any such desire to kill my father and marry my mother. No, that's not how I feel. That's not me. That's not where I am. And the psychiatrist says, and he makes a note and he says, to protest the parallel is to acknowledge it. To protest, you're protesting. And you're like, but I never see, you're protesting even more. To protest is to acknowledge. That's just evident. It's evidence of how deeply you have suppressed your desire to kill your father and marry your mother. Now, this is classic unfalsifiability talk. Okay, that when there is evidence that is like clearly incompatible with a theory, you just dismiss it as some kind of acknowledgement of the theory. I had someone, he watches my channel, so he'll be watching this, a skeptic, on social media this week. I quoted the bit about in one of the epistles of Peter where it says, we have not followed cunningly devised tales. And I'm like, look, they knew what cunningly devised tales, they knew what stories were, they knew what fiction was, and it's explicitly saying, no, that's not what these are. So that shows you how, now I think it was actually written by Peter, how Peter intended the stories he told, like to Mark, for example, but it also shows you how the original Christian community thought of these things, that it was important, that they were not made up. And the skeptic came back and said, well, the very fact that he says that means that they were being taken to be, the stories in the Gospels were being taken to be cunningly devised tales. And that's why he's objecting to it. Okay, so it's very similar. If Jesus really rose bodily from the dead, and bodily appeared to his disciples. Just entertain that hypothesis for a minute, because, we're all about the Bayes factor and, what hypothesis, whether the bodily resurrection explains the evidence better than its negation. All right? So let's think about the explanatory resources of bodily resurrection, which includes bodily appearances. What more could he have done to make it clear than what he did? Okay? If one approaches the evidence the way that Dr. Allison approaches it, the more explicit and careful Jesus is to make his bodily nature known. Like, here, touch me. Okay, you still are worried that I'm a ghost? Okay, do you have any food? Okay, give me some food, I'm gonna eat. The more Allison dismisses it as being made up. It's very clear wherever he says reflect apologetical concerns. To protest the parallel is to acknowledge it. Well, in that case, the visionary or non-bodily hypothesis becomes unfalsifiable, because very clear, explicit evidence to the contrary is for that very reason dismissed as not really being part of the evidence. That I don't have to account for this as, what the original alleged witnesses claimed. I don't have to account for this as what the original alleged witnesses experienced. I don't have to treat it as data at all. It's just something that was added later in some anonymous fashion or by the authors of the Gospels, whoever they were, to try to convince people, which, as I've often pointed out, would be a lie, by the way, that Jesus was risen again. Okay, but it's being simply pushed off from the place where you've got your data. Here's your data, and then you take that and you go, and you just get rid of it. It's not part of your data that you really have to explain anymore as even part of their initial claims. And the very reason you're doing it is because it would falsify this apparition or vision. Allison is an objective vision theorist, vision hypothesis. That's a terrible way to approach the evidence. That shows that the evidence is not ambiguous, but one is making it appear ambiguous by simply getting rid of some of the evidence, because if it were really evidence, then the evidence wouldn't be ambiguous. Okay, I do have a couple more things to say about Allison's apparition view and the gospel accounts, and we'll continue with that next time. So please come back to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.